The topic is Denial of Antiblackness, Oblique Identification, and the Specter of the Haitian Revolution. Respect. Come on. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great honor and privilege to be here. Dr. Allen is one of the few people that I consider to be one of my great friends. And I also want to thank the organizers, Gean Moreno, also Isabella Rodriguez. Is she here? No, she's not. So thank you so much. I know it takes a lot of work to put these things together. And thank you for your presence. As Dr. Allen mentioned, this comes from my latest book. And what you need to know about what I'm going to tell you about today is that it comes from a sustained dialogue with organized groups of people in Brazil and in the US fighting what they call, and I call, anti-Blackness. What I want to propose today is the following argument. If we pay attention to the world around us, if we pay attention to newspapers, magazines, television, and social media, an argument can be made that there's a greater awareness of Black suffering. You think of relatively recent movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement transnationally, and that has quickly become a multiracial movement. In some places, it's actually everything but a Black movement. I have a student who just did a dissertation on the Black Lives Matter movement in Austin, Texas, and most of the activists there are white. So this is what I mean by multiracial awareness of Black suffering. At the same time, however, there is a resistance or an incapacity. Is the sound okay? It sounds weird from where I am. There's an echo, right? At the same time that there's this greater awareness of Black suffering, there's a resistance or an incapacity to deal with what I call the structural aspects of anti-Blackness. How anti-Blackness is not just this temporary phenomenon, but rather is a key feature of societies, I would say, in the world. So it's not something transient, it's something permanent. It's not something that happens here or there, but it's something that defines the modern world. And because of this incapacity to deal with the structural aspects of anti-Blackness, I would also propose that there's a denial in recognizing that Black people suffer through social processes in very specific ways. And I'll say later why that's important. What I mentioned earlier, this greater recognition of Black suffering together with the incapacity to deal with the structural issues of Black suffering, that's what I'm calling oblique identification. You identify, you recognize, but only partially. Why is this important? As I mentioned previously, by not engaging anti-Blackness, we are not engaging with what makes the modern world. It's as simple as that. By not engaging with anti-Blackness, we are not engaging with what I argue constitutes one of the foundational mechanisms by which democracy functions. It's a counterintuitive statement, but I want to suggest that even seemingly beneficial and good institutions function often by denying Black people the access to those same institutions. More specifically, when we don't deal with anti-Blackness, what we don't engage with is the fact that in places like Brazil, in places like Colombia, in places like Venezuela, Black folks are still disproportionately targeted by lethal processes. Black folks die more frequently by preventable causes than other social groups. So not engaging with anti-Blackness means not recognizing those very simple and yet often denied aspects of modern societies. So why are Black folks so vulnerable? Why are Black folks so likely to die early by preventable causes? I want to suggest that this world is built on the hatred of Black people. I want to suggest that together with this hatred comes a fear that what happened in Haiti at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, will happen elsewhere. And as I say this, and I look to my dear friend Jafari, I'm reminded of how quotidian that fear of the Haitian Revolution is. So in Austin, where we lived for over a decade, every year, downtown and several of the shopping malls would shut down during the Texas relays. That, I suggest, is one contemporary manifestation of the fear of the Haitian Revolution, the fear that a group of Black people will threaten the constitution of what's considered to be the good society. So this specter of Haiti, I'm going to be going back to this theme as I focus more specifically on Brazil and on the US. Now, before you start thinking that, who's this person who's coming up with all these statements, let me restate once again that what I'm offering here comes out of collective efforts in combating some of the issues I mentioned. So, for example, I worked for over a decade at the Coalition Against Police Abuse, formed by former Black Panther Party members. So we talk about Black Lives Matter movement today, and we talk about police abuse. Police abuse has been one of the constant historical markers of this country and other countries of the Black diaspora. I've also collaborated with favela organizers in Brazil who were also dealing with very similar themes. Actually, I went back to Brazil, even though I'm from Brazil, but I went back from Brazil after many years because these former Black Panther Party members told me, look, there's something going on there, you should check it out, and we want to collaborate. And what they were talking about, the Panthers, the former Panthers, were talking about these Black folks in Brazil organizing against police abuse. I've also been involved, and Jafari Allen has met some of those folks at Criolla, and these are Black women organized in very extensive networks in Brazil, dealing with domestic abuse, dealing with homophobia, dealing with environmental pollution, and other factors that impact Black people, but Black women disproportionately. So what's really important to take into account is while I'm emphasizing anti-Blackness is always gendered, it's always sexualized. Since relocating to Riverside in California, I've been pushed into this work with Haitian folks detained currently in Adelanto. That's a desert city in the middle of California. And these Haitian folks seek asylum in the US after spending many years in Brazil and spending a lot of their time in other countries of so-called Latin America. And that work is also a window into this worldwide anti-Blackness. Folks who have worked with asylum seekers throughout the US for many years are often perplexed at the differentiated treatment that Haitian asylum seekers receive. So all those folks in those detention centers are catching hell undeniably. And yet somehow these Haitian folks are treated even worse. And I can talk about that later if you are so interested. I've also spent 5 years in a juvenile prison in Texas. And once again, even though that was an environment where Latina, X, and Black folks were the majority, there were very interesting differences between how the Latinx folk and the Black young people were treated. Once again, always worse for Black folks, even though, of course, all of those people incarcerated are catching hell. So this is where what I'm talking about today comes from. It's from this sustained dialogue with those people. The mural on your top left, that's of Michael Zinzin, that's the former Panther who was the coordinator of the Coalition Against Police Abuse in LA. He passed in 2006. The bottom left, those are some of the women at Criolla. The person at the bottom, Jurema Werneck, is not at Criolla anymore. She's now the director for Amnesty International for the entire country of Brazil. So that goes to show that that kind of work has resonated beyond those Black communities. And the pictures on your right are of the community that I just mentioned in Jacarezinho, the largest Black community in Rio, and some of the work that was done in the early 2000s as an attempt to curb police abuse was to close down the neighborhood. So we actually put up these metal fences, and as you can predict, that created a major scandal in a city, because whereas white condominiums can close themselves off no problem, when Black people don't do that, that becomes a matter of concern. And the person at the bottom is one of the people. I think, Jafari, were you there when we brought him to? Yes. So this is one of the activists that was being threatened. His life was being threatened, and with Dr. Allen and others, we made up a fellowship. He spent a year in Austin, basically to save his life. There's a theory behind anti-Blackness, and that theory relies on a view of slavery that's not so much about slavery as a historical event, but rather slavery as a theory of social relations. Not to negate that slavery was awful and it existed, of course, we all know about slavery, but as importantly, slavery also provided a framework, a blueprint for how, to this day, we interact with each other. And that blueprint remains among us, and that's what Hartman and others call the afterlife of slavery. It stays in institutional memory. Dr. Allen went down the list of some of the manifestations of that institutional memory. It is also manifested in conscious and unconscious ways that we manifest anti-Black bias. I'm reminded here of the work of Jennifer Eberhardt, who was able to get to our unconscious mind through controlled experiments. And what she showed was that there's this association that we all harbor, all of us, regardless of our background, regardless of our race, our gender and sexuality, and regardless of our politics. That's the most troubling. What she said is that we all harbor an association between Black folks and apes. And if that's true, then the idea of anti-Blackness gains one more element that makes it even more problematic. If that's in our unconscious, how do we change that? How do we begin tackling this foundational problem? Fanon and other authors will take it a step further and will say that anti-Blackness is our collective unconscious and is really the air that we breathe. We would not be alive, we would not survive if we did not hate Black folks, if we did not associate Black folks with non-humanity, with animals. So what's at stake here, at the end of the day, is a notion of humanity, with capital H, that depends on anti-Blackness, depends on making Black folks not human. That's ultimately what I'm talking about. So I'm actually suggesting that we shift, for those of us who like to think of ourselves as progressive folk, I'm asking us to shift the way that we think about the world. So one way to think about the world is through the lens of racism. And when we do that, we suggest that the world is divided between those who have privilege, white folks, of course, mediated by gender, mediated by your possessions, mediated by sexuality, but nevertheless, white folks as the most privileged on the one hand, and non-whites on the other. That's the world of racism. So non-whites here are the ultimate humans, whereas non-whites possess fractions of humanity. Yeah, 0.5, 0.6. We have historical examples of that too. The world of anti-Blackness is a totally different world. In the world of anti-Blackness, what I suggest is that the dyad that makes sense is between black and non-black, in such a way that while black folks are the ultimate non-humans, the non-blacks possess fractions of humanity. You see the difference? Kind of, sort of. Try to illustrate this. As bell hooks would say, racism is the combined effects of cis heteropatriarchal capitalist white supremacy. So you put all of these forces together and you structure the world according to them, and you form hierarchies of value, human value, that then translate into the kinds of resources that people have access to or have not access to. What I want you to take into account here is that the world of racism, from a progressive perspective, says that non-whites experience differentiated but related forms of oppression. We get that very powerful theorization from the Combahee River Collective, from Ruthie Gilmore, and from others. This theorization has changed our understanding about racism. And it is not only an important theoretical intervention, but it's also a very powerful political tool. It was able to bring to a common cause folks from different backgrounds, right? As the diagram illustrates. So this is the world of racism. Again, the Combahee River Collective, they stress that these multiple oppressions, as they interlock, create the conditions of our lives. They stress the experiences of black women, but very interestingly and very understandably also stress that all women of color, and ultimately all folks of color, go through similar forms of oppression. There's another definition that I like a lot, and it's also very powerful, Ruthie Gilmore's definition, that is even more to the point. And what she says that racism are all those processes created by the state and by society by which vulnerability to death are produced and exploited. So at the end of the day, racism is about who dies and who doesn't. What kind of life are you able to live? And in Gilmore, just as interestingly, and it's part of her definition that we usually don't pay too much attention to, but she finishes that definition by stressing that those differentiated vulnerabilities to death are happening in distinct yet interconnected political geographies. So emphasis on the interconnectedness. It happens in different groups, but ultimately, because all of these groups experience forms of that racism, all of those groups are somehow connected with each other. The world of anti-Blackness is a different world. So as I stated previously, the social world is defined by Black folks on the one hand and non-Blacks on the other. Whites, again, and that's another constant, are the ultimate, the quintessential humans. And here in this diagram and in this world, the non-Blacks, non-whites have fractions of humanity. So Black folks excluded, white folks, the quintessential humans, and non-whites, non-Blacks with fractions of humanity. So Black folks here define the human, but are not human. You get that from a bunch of different sources. One that I particularly like is Du Bois. He wrote this at the end of the 20th century. So this is the 19th century. So this is not any kind of novelty. And this is what he was saying back then, 1899. So he's seeing this progressive expansion of the idea of humanity. So he's suggesting that slowly but surely, the folks in Asia are somewhat recognized. The brown Indians are reluctantly recognized. But when it comes to Black people, we come to a full stop. This is Du Bois, and that's precisely that full stop statement that reinforces the notion of anti-Blackness. Humanity is closed off for Black folks. So what I want to share with you here is one case study, and maybe we can talk about 3 other studies if we have time and you're interested. But one of them is one of the many police murders of a person in a Black community in Brazil and what happened after that. And I want to use that example to show how the world of racism, as well-intentioned as it is, sometimes misses what is specific about the experiences of those folks the anti-racists are organizing for. You with me here? So yes, we all want to be anti-racist, hands down, no question about it. What I'm showing, though, is that in the world of racism, because of how racism is constructed and how we think about racism, we sometimes miss what's at the core of, say, police abuse, what's at the core of death caused by preventable causes, death caused by preventable elements. So I'll go through these 2 cases, and it's almost inevitable these days not to talk about the fascist president that now sits in the Brazilian government. And I'm going to suggest that even though the current Brazilian president, yes, he's a fascist, yes, he's a racist, yes, he's authoritarian, but above all, he would not have been elected if he were not anti-Black in a very effective way. So what elected him, I think, was his anti-Blackness, not so much his racism. This is how he campaigned. So the gesture that is now linked to him and to his political bloc is of him holding a gun. Him as the representative of the state. You need to keep that in mind. Representative of the state and representative of all Brazilians. So what is he saying? Don't mess with us anymore. You mess with us, we are going to shoot and kill you. Now, keep this picture in mind and reflect on who is he pointing the gun to. So the case that I want to talk about is, the first case is that of Amarildo. He became known by his first name in anti-racist campaigns that followed. A construction worker, 6 kids, in many ways a typical working class black male heteronormative Brazilian. What's tragic about his case is that he was tortured and killed, the investigations later revealed, by the so-called new police. The police that was reformed following anti-racist demands. So anti-racist folks were saying, this police is out of hand, you're killing black people and impoverished people left and right, you need to change. And the government said, well, okay, let's change it. We are going to train our officers in human rights, 2 classes, and we're going to train our officers to appease rather than repress. So we're going to train our officers to talk with folks and develop a communitarian type of police. So much for that. The fact that Amarildo lived in the largest favela in Brazil, favelas are historically black neighborhoods. That's what favelas are. The fact that he lived in the largest favela in Brazil also meant that he lived in a place that was full of NGOs and community organizations. That's one of the reasons why his case became so well known. This here is an example of the old police and the new police. The old police would shoot and kill and be proud of it. Black bodies everywhere. I once did the math on this, and the police operations on average would kill 5 young people, each incursion. So think of a day in any of these favelas as having at least 3 or 4 incursions per week, and you get a sense of the state campaign against those very specific types of bodies and people. The new model, established in 2008, is explicitly concerned with moving away from the military. This is also very American-based, right? These folks are trained by U.S. military personnel. So they're using somewhat civilian clothing, and they're emphasizing that communitarian perspective. It didn't work. They were torturing, they were killing, and even though there was this initial optimism about the new police, the press, the intellectuals, so many of my friends were yes, finally, this has worked. A little bit like Obama here. We can talk about that later. It didn't work. So the question is why? With all the best intentions, we're going to reform the police, we're going to have a different approach, we recognize the problems. Why was Amarildo killed, and why were so many other folks killed by the new police? New clothing, new orientations, same pattern. So they never found his body. At some point, they thought that they had his bones in a adjoining city. Turned out not to be. So that's the case of Amarildo. Interestingly, because the protests happened in the world of racism and anti-racism, the protests were multiracial, which is a good thing, right? I'm not criticizing that. The moment in which those protests happened also facilitated the extension of those protests. Lots of folks got involved in the demand for Amarildo and his body and for punishment. And what was really interesting too, and this is what I want to focus on with you, is that the protesters were often heard saying, this is about police brutality that affects the poor, the black, and the resident of the periphery. See how this is the world of racism? So it's not just specifically about black folks. It's about all of those who are victimized by police as if the other non-black folks are victimized in the same way. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to in any way minimize the suffering and the fact that non-black folks experience police brutality too. Of course, we all know that. We all know that. That's not the point. The point is to be willing to recognize that social processes such as police brutality are fundamentally based on the hatred and dehumanization of black people. So it happens against black folks paradigmatically, foundationally, and happens to other folks also, but not with that root. So that's one of the problems of this approach. That's a picture of the folks protesting. The case of Claudia Ferreira, and each and every time I'm planning these presentations, of course, the Hartman comes to mind, and what's the point of once again bringing these pictures of black suffering? We've become anesthetized, we've become accustomed to black suffering and to black death, so I should be really refusing to do that. The good thing here is that I haven't shown you the pictures of her death. Hers were horrific. She was killed in one police operation, just like Amarildo, like many others. And then they put her body in a truck. And somehow the door opened. So it's as if they killed her and then they lynched her. And the body was filmed being dragged for many yards. So it was an awful scene. But the same multiracial crowd, thankfully, got together, protested. So it didn't go unnoticed like many other deaths. But still, the political phrase that was utilized is that what happened to Claudia happens to the poor, the black, and the resident of the periphery. And that statement, again, suggests that we are dividing the world between whites and non-whites, the better off, the not so well off, the residents of the formal city, the residents of the periphery. So what's wrong with this? So these alliances, they operate in a world of racism. They present themselves as anti-racist. They stress these points of contact, these similarities between blacks, Latinx, the impoverished. But with all of this good, they miss what's at the core of these events. And they therefore miss the specificity of black experiences. And if we're talking about police killings, this is a diasporic phenomenon. So the United States, compared to Brazil, is not that bad, but the Malcolm X grassroots movement showed in 2015 that one person is killed every 28 hours, one black person, either by the state or by somebody supported by the state, like the cases of Trayvon Martin. He wasn't exactly the state, but he was supported by the state. And these numbers are pretty consistent. So the Guardian did their independent research and they came up with a very similar number. Now, I think you have it bad in the US. In Brazil, you have this context that is way more intense. So what I'm suggesting here is that it's not so much a matter of comparing Brazil and the US, but it's a matter of tracing the relations between the US and Brazil. What do the US and Brazil have in common? They have this history in slavery. And what is slavery? Slavery is a blueprint for social relations. And what does this blueprint say? The blueprint says that black folks are not human. If that is true, then it should not come as a surprise that the US and Brazil and other diasporic nations treat black folks as if we are not human. Now, police brutality may be the most obvious one, but it's not the only one. So there are a bunch of other factors that we could talk about if we had time, but think of death at birth, think of cardiovascular diseases, think of death caused by exposure to environmental toxins, think of death caused by depression and other preventable and treatable causes. And all of that, when put together, gives you a sense of the specificity of black people's experiences throughout the diaspora. But let me go back to Brazil and show you how these patterns of anti-black violence acquire very specific contours when we break down who are we talking about when we talk about black folks. And the fact is that black women, children, and LGBTQ folks among black folks are disproportionately vulnerable to these forms of violence. And it just so happened that a few weeks ago, a very reputable research institution in Brazil published the Atlas of Violence with data that show, for example, that whereas the homicide rates, and this is really troubling, the homicide rates for Brazil as a whole is stable and even falling. Stable or even falling for the country as a whole. For black folks, it's increasing. So not only it happens at a much more intense frequency, but it's increasing. And the reason why it's troubling is because if you will have noticed, and if you know about Brazilian politics, the period from 2015 all the way back to 2007, this is during a socialist administration that is as good as it will ever get. If we're talking about socialist administrations, we're talking about the Workers' Party that in 3 federal administrations was able to lift roughly 50.2 million people out of poverty. They instituted this thing called a family stipend. They instituted incentives for kids to go to school, for the impoverished to get credit for housing, for appliances, for cars, for traveling. It was a completely different country up until recently. And yet, with all of these gains, amazing gains, the Workers' Party was utterly unable or unwilling to deal with anti-Blackness. The violence against black folks increased. Those processes that I mentioned earlier also increased. So forms of death caused by preventable factors, those increased too. The other thing that I want to stress, if you think I'm being crazy, right, saying, wow, this dude is really crazy. This is a number cruncher institution. These are economists, demographers, statisticians, white, extremely well-educated folks in Brazil. They come up with these data. And notice how they divided the social world they are studying. This is, I had no idea when I looked up the data. I just found out when I was doing the revisions for this stuff. They are dividing the world into blacks and non-blacks. These are the statisticians, the demographers. And guess who they put in the non-black world? Whites, got that right, and what else? Asians, which in the US would work too. They also put the indigenous. They also put the indigenous in that group, which says what? As much hell as those other groups suffer, statistically, they are closer in their experiences with one another than with black folks. I was in shock too, because those kinds of data usually come with an asterisk and says, well, we don't have enough information on the indigenous folk and all of that. And don't get me wrong, Brazil is a genocidal country, right? Against indigenous folks. But what we don't know is that Brazil is a genocidal country against black folks too. So this is very telling. So that statistical analysis, maybe even unwillingly, is suggesting that the world of anti-Blackness is the more precise, is the more accurate way to make sense of what's going on. Homicide rates for women, black women, not only are murdered more often than non-black women, but that rate is also increasing. So the distance between the experiences of black women and non-black women is becoming ever more different. And the homicide of LGBTQ folks, which in Brazil are also overwhelmingly black, we don't take that into account because the most visible folks are not black folks. But the levels of violence against LGBTQ folks in Brazil concerning black people and non-black people is also very telling of this anti-black logic. What are we dealing with? So it's anti-Blackness, it's genocidal, and it's based on a de facto apartheid. Many of us have this idea of Brazil as the exception, right? In the world of racial relations, Brazil as the land of racial democracy. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of the aspects of anti-black violence that I just mentioned, they not only target specific people, but they happen in very identifiable geographical locations. Hence, the apartheid nature of Brazilian society. Show me where violence occurs, and chances are that those areas are disproportionately and historically black areas. So the favelas, the black neighborhoods that I mentioned earlier, those would be the spaces that are seen as the abject spaces, the spaces of non-belonging, non-humanity in a Brazilian apartheid. So Rio, we've been talking about Rio. So most of the non-US people's experience of Rio is that the little blue areas along the coast and other privileged neighborhoods where levels of formal education are pretty good, where life expectancy is pretty high, all of this vis-a-vis the rest of the country, where tap water is relatively usable. Public transportation, that's a big one. It actually serves those areas. And then the brown areas are the areas where black folks live. And those are not only areas devoid of urban infrastructure, but also areas defined by the exact opposite dynamics, where people die earlier by preventable causes, where people die at the hands of the states, the police, where educational facilities are non-existent or really bad, and the list goes on. So this is a sense of the Brazilian apartheid, and it's a diasporic phenomenon. Those of you familiar with the dot maps in the US, the latest one that I took a look at were drawn from the 2010 census. And it's the exact same phenomenon. This is Detroit, but it could have been Miami, it could have been LA, it could have been New York. So those patterns of residential segregation are themselves an indication of how anti-Blackness is foundational to these cities, to how these nation states are organized. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that when they came up with those new forms of police, I need to hurry up, right? Those new forms of police, they created new police stations, and what they did was to create a wall, an armed wall, protecting privileged white folks in Rio from the alleged violent and criminal black areas. So if you have been to Rio recently, since 2008, and you land in the airport, you will not only see this very evident police presence, but you also see these walls separating the tourist areas from the favelas. Particularly on your way, when you take the bus or the taxi from the airport to Copacabana, you see those walls, making it clear this separation. So anti-Blackness is a diasporic phenomenon. And because it's a diasporic phenomenon, so is genocide. There's a way to think about the diaspora that stresses cultural commonalities, that stress struggle. I'm not diminishing or discounting any of that, but I would also like to suggest that what defines the diaspora is the fact that black folks die early and by preventable causes, as a matter of fact. And this is nothing new. In 1951, William Patterson, with the Civil Rights Congress in the US, wrote a document called We Charge Genocide. Very few folks know of that document. And it was based primarily on data of police abuse. 1951. Brazilians have written about that too. There's a 1978 publication by Abdias Nascimento, and there are others. So Bolsonaro's genius is that he didn't have to invent anything. When he pointed a gun and made that the symbol of his campaign, everyone understood to whom he was pointing a gun. That's my contention. We want to elect him because he's going to explicitly take care of black folks and kill them if necessary. That was his stroke of genius. I know it's a controversial thesis, not that many people like it. All you have to do is pay attention to what has happened in Brazil since he took office. So since he took office, these levels of violence that I mentioned previously have increased. There's a greater availability of firearms, because part of Bolsonaro's campaign is, I'm going to relax the gun-owning legislation so that everyone can have access to a gun. And more importantly, during his campaign, his supporters engaged in several acts of brutality against black folks that were well publicized. So even though he's not saying that explicitly, he has already created this license to abuse and kill black people. So yes, it is about authoritarianism, no question about it. Is it about fascism? Yes, but fundamentally it's about anti-Blackness. When Bolsonaro holds his gun, what I think he's recycling is the fear of the Haitian Revolution. Why? And this is so interesting. I wish we had an entire day to discuss this. And why does he have to stress that so much? Because ironically, the Workers' Party administration became known as the administration that was friendly and supportive of black people. So his campaign claim was that enough of those Workers' Party people, enough of this socialism stuff, but more importantly, enough of these black folks in our universities, in the car dealerships, in spaces that were previously separated. If you talk to any white person in Brazil that's not politicized, chances are that that white person will mention one of these scenes that I just mentioned to you. Super common. This university used to be great. And now, with affirmative action, I'm having to find another school for my child. Airports used to be these places that were to be enjoyed, clean, where good people congregated, and now? You see what I'm saying? So with the social gains brought about by the Workers' Party, which were many, Black folks began to be seen in places where they had never been seen before in those great numbers. So Bolsonaro's campaign was saying, I hear you, white folks, I'm going to reinstitute those good old apartheid segregation barriers, including state violence. That's why I think we need to pay attention to these forms of the denial of anti-Blackness. Ultimately, because it is anti-Blackness that's encrypted in our notion of the human. It may not emerge so obviously, but that's what's informing whose lives are considered valuable and whose lives are considered not that valuable. And the denial of anti-Blackness, when we deny anti-Blackness, we also restrict our world because we don't look beyond acceptance. We don't look beyond integration, because the world of racism is what? Ultimately, the world of racism and anti-racism is about integration. Think about the civil rights movement. What did the civil rights movement want? It wanted a place at the table. It wanted that Black folks and other non-whites have access, all good things, mind you, access to resources previously not accessible, right? What would happen if we stopped thinking about integration? What if we not wanted? What if integration actually means more of the same? You may get a foot through the door, but then what? And I say this, and I'm just realizing why I'm saying this. I'm saying this primarily because the folks in Brazil, the Black people in Brazil who dedicated their lives to this project of integration, got into the Workers' Party administration, did a lot of good, but now that administration is over, and we back to where we were, just like that. See? So those were laudable objectives. Of course, we all want better lives. What I'm asking here is there another route? Is there a way of doing politics that starts from the requirement of multiracial alliances? Progressive folks here and in Brazil start with that requirement. It's a requirement. If you're not multiracial, you're crazy. Is there another way to do politics? Mind you, I'm not saying let's not make alliances. Yes, by all means, we need alliances. But what if we started with the recognition of anti-Blackness and then built alliances? You see, that's a very different route. So that multiracial alliances become a possibility rather than a requirement. So those are the thoughts I want to leave you with. And fundamentally, what would happen if we just accepted that that's what's around us? Just accept the hatred rather than fight it. I know it sounds nihilistic, but it's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. I think it's liberating. If you accept that no matter what, with your PhD, with your new possessions, with all of that, we are going to be hated no matter what. And if that's the case, then what do we do? So some of the folks in Salvador, I was mentioning that in a conversation earlier, some of these folks were campaigning, they were out in the streets, and they did, oh, they're amazing. And now they say, you know what? Nothing's happening. Let's go back to our communities. Let's build our schools. It's not a new project, right? Let's build our schools. Let's forget integration. And the other thing, too, is that I ask folks, is Brazil your country? And the young folks are saying, That's deep. Do you belong? I don't belong. So if you don't belong, where are you going? What do you do? So those are the kinds of challenges that I find to be exciting challenges, even if as an intellectual exercise to imagine new worlds. And I'm mentioning new worlds because when I now talk with those folks in Brazil, to me they seem like extraterrestrial people. This is not our world. We don't belong. We're just going to do our thing. And I think once you do that, the possibilities kind of expand. So thank you. Thanks for your time.